You shouldn't be here. We only let you come out of pity. Those were the exact words my daughter-in-law whispered to me in the hallway of her own wedding reception, loud enough for a dozen guests to hear. I just smiled. Because in my purse was a USB drive containing 6 months of evidence that would destroy her in the next 8 minutes. 200 wedding guests would witness what happened next. Their phones would capture every second. And within 48 hours, the video would be viewed by over 3 million people. My name is Margaret. I'm 58 years old. And I'm about to tell you the story of how I spent my entire retirement savings to expose the woman who was systematically destroying my son's life. Some people called me a hero. Others called me a monster. But by the time you hear the whole story, you'll understand why I had no other choice. That USB drive sat in my purse for exactly 7 days before the wedding. Every single night that week, I held it in my hands at 3 in the morning, asking myself the same question. Was I about to save my son or destroy him? Because once I handed that drive to Carmen, the wedding coordinator, there would be no turning back. No phone call could stop it. No change of heart could undo it. In 8 minutes, 200 guests would see everything. The hotels, the men, the money, the lies that had been carefully constructed over 2.5 years. My son would watch the woman he loved disintegrate in front of everyone he knew. His colleagues, his childhood friends, his late father's family, everyone. I'm a retired nurse. I spent 32 years at County General Hospital in Philadelphia. I've held the hands of dying patients. I've delivered news that shattered families. I've made impossible decisions in emergency rooms when seconds mattered. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what I was about to do on June 14th, 2023. Because this wasn't a stranger on an operating table. This was my son, my only child. The boy I raised alone after his father died when he was 9 years old. The man I had sacrificed everything for. And I was about to humiliate him in the most public way possible. But here's what you need to understand before you judge me. What I discovered about Jessica wasn't just an affair. It wasn't just one mistake or one moment of weakness. What I uncovered was a pattern of deception so calculated, so methodical, that it took a former police detective 6 months to document it all. My son wasn't just being cheated on, he was being used. Financially, socially, emotionally. Jessica had turned my son into a cover story for a life he knew nothing about. And if I didn't stop it, he would have married her. He would have given her access to everything. His savings, his home, his future children. And he would have spent years, maybe decades, living a lie while she continued doing exactly what she'd been doing all along. The moment she whispered those words to me in that hallway, "You're only here out of pity," something inside me clicked. Because that wasn't just cruelty. That was confirmation. Confirmation that she had no respect for me, no respect for my son, and absolutely no intention of being the faithful wife she was pretending to be. She thought she had won. She thought she had successfully pushed me out of my son's life. She thought that after today, she would control everything. His money, his decisions, his relationship with me. She had no idea that in my purse, in a simple black USB drive, was 6 months of surveillance footage, bank records, text messages, and photographic evidence that would end her performance in less time than it takes to toast champagne. By the end of this story, you're going to know everything. You'll know exactly what I found. You'll know why I waited. You'll know what happened when that video started playing on those screens. You'll hear what my son said to me when he finally spoke to me again 3 weeks later. And you'll have to decide for yourself whether I was right or wrong. But I promise you this. Once you hear what Jessica was really doing, once you see the evidence the way I saw it, you'll understand why I made the choice I made. And maybe, just maybe, you'll realize that sometimes protecting someone you love means becoming the villain in their story, at least for a little while. Before we go any further, I need something from you. Drop a comment right now and let me know where you're watching from. I want to see how far this story reaches, because I know I'm not the only mother who's ever had to make an impossible choice. If you've ever had to protect someone you love, even when it meant they might hate you for it, this story is for you. Hit that subscribe button right now, because what I'm about to tell you is going to challenge everything you think you know about love, loyalty, and the lengths a mother will go to save her child. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the stories we share on this channel. Stories about real people making real decisions in impossible situations. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, someone who's watching their child make a terrible mistake, share this video with them. They'll thank you later. Now let me take you back to where this really started. Not to the wedding day. Not to the moment I hired the private investigator, but to a cold February night 8 months earlier, when I walked into an upscale French restaurant to celebrate my son's birthday and saw something that would change everything. February 8th, 2023. That's the date everything changed. But to understand why that night mattered, you need to know who I was before all of this happened. My name is Margaret Sullivan. I'm 58 years old. I was born and raised in a working-class neighborhood in South Philadelphia, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone and you didn't lock your doors at night. I became a registered nurse in 1991 after putting myself through community college and then nursing school at Temple University. It took me 6 years because I was working full-time at a diner to pay for it. No student loans, no help from my parents who had already passed away by then. Just me, my paychecks, and a determination to build something better than what I had growing up. I met my husband Thomas in 1993 at a hospital charity event. He was a construction foreman, 8 years older than me, with kind eyes and rough hands that had built half the commercial buildings in downtown Philadelphia. We got married 6 months later in a small ceremony at City Hall because neither of us had money for anything fancy and neither of us cared. We were happy. Genuinely, completely happy in a way that didn't need expensive things or grand gestures. We had a tiny apartment in Fishtown, a car that broke down twice a month, and dreams of starting a family. On September 12, 1997, I gave birth to our son. We named him Daniel Thomas Sullivan, 7 pounds 9 ounces, perfect in every single way. Thomas held him in that delivery room and cried like a baby himself, saying over and over, "We made a miracle, Maggie. We actually made a miracle." For 9 years, we were a complete family. Thomas worked construction during the day. I worked night shifts at County General, so one of us was always home with Daniel. We lived paycheck to paycheck, but Daniel never knew it. He had birthday parties. He had Christmas mornings with presents under a tree. He had 2 parents who loved him more than anything in this world. And then, on a Tuesday morning in October 2006, Thomas kissed me goodbye, told me he loved me, walked out the door to a construction site in Center City, and never came home. Massive heart attack at 41 years old. No warning, no previous symptoms. The doctors said it was genetic, something called hypertrophic cardiomyopathy that no one knew he had. One minute he was alive, laughing with his crew about something stupid. The next minute he was gone, dead before the ambulance even arrived. I was 33 years old, a widow with a 9-year-old son and $42,000 in debt from my nursing degree that I was still paying off. Thomas had a small life insurance policy through his union, $50,000, which sounds like a lot until you realize it barely covered his funeral and gave us maybe 6 months of breathing room. I had a choice to make. I could fall apart, which is what I wanted to do every single day for the first year, or I could keep going for Daniel. I chose Daniel. I picked up every extra shift the hospital would give me. Double shifts, overnight shifts, weekend shifts, holiday shifts, when time and a half pay meant I could put an extra $200 toward groceries or Daniel's school expenses. I missed soccer games. I missed parent-teacher conferences. I missed school plays and award ceremonies, and so many moments I can never get back. But Daniel never went without. He had cleats for soccer. He had a laptop for school. He had birthday parties and Christmas mornings, and a college fund that I built one overtime shift at a time. My son grew up to be exactly the kind of man his father would have been proud of. Compassionate, honest, hardworking, loyal to a fault. He graduated from Drexel University with a degree in civil engineering, the first person in our family to finish college. He got a good job at an engineering firm in Center City. He bought his own apartment in Northern Liberties when he was 27. He called me every Sunday without fail. We had dinner together almost every week, usually at my place where I'd make his favorite foods, pot roast and mashed potatoes, the same meal Thomas used to request every birthday. For 26 years, it was just the 2 of us against the world. And I was okay with that. More than okay. I was proud of what we'd built together. Proud of the man he'd become despite losing his father so young. Then in April of 2021, Daniel called me on a Wednesday night, which was unusual because Wednesday wasn't our normal call day. He sounded different. Excited in a way I hadn't heard since he was a kid on Christmas morning. "Mom," he said, "I met someone. Her name is Jessica. I met her at this charity gala my company sponsored last weekend, and Mom, she's incredible. She's beautiful and smart and funny, and I really think you're going to love her." My heart did this thing where it simultaneously leapt with joy and clenched with fear. Joy because my son, my sweet boy who'd been so focused on his career that he barely dated, had finally found someone who made him happy. Fear because I knew that whoever this woman was, she was going to change everything. Our Sunday dinners would become less frequent. Our phone calls would get shorter. The relationship that had been the center of my universe for 26 years was about to shift, and I wasn't sure I was ready for it. But I pushed that fear down deep and said all the right things. "That's wonderful, honey. I can't wait to meet her. When can you bring her by?" The first time I met Jessica Mitchell was 3 weeks later at a Sunday brunch Daniel organized at this trendy cafe in Old City. I got there early, nervous in a way I hadn't been nervous in years. I'd bought a new blouse for the occasion. Nothing fancy, just something from Macy's that wasn't my usual nurse scrubs or old t-shirts. I wanted to make a good impression on this woman who'd captured my son's heart. I was sitting at the table Daniel had reserved, sipping water and checking my phone every 30 seconds when they walked in. Daniel saw me first and waved, his face lit up like a Christmas tree, and next to him was Jessica. The first thing I noticed was how beautiful she was, not in a normal, everyday way, but in that polished, expensive way you see in magazines. She was wearing a cream-colored suit that I later learned was Chanel, which meant nothing to me at the time, except that it looked expensive. Her hair was this perfect honey blonde, the kind that comes from a high-end salon, not a box from CVS. She had on sunglasses even though we were indoors, designer ones with little interlocking C's on the sides. And her heels, my God. These 4-inch stilettos that clicked on the hardwood floor like gunshots with every step. Daniel introduced us, and Jessica pulled off her sunglasses with this practiced gesture, like she was in a movie. "Mrs. Sullivan," she said, extending her hand. "It's so wonderful to finally meet you. Daniel has told me so much about you. You're a nurse at County General? That's such important, meaningful work." The words were perfect. The tone was warm. But something in her eyes when she first looked at me, just for a fraction of a second before that smile locked into place, something in that look made my stomach drop. It was disdain. Cold, quick, almost imperceptible, but definitely there. The way you might look at a stain on a tablecloth or a piece of gum on your shoe. There and gone so fast I almost thought I imagined it, so I ignored it. I told myself I was being paranoid, overprotective, the cliché of the mother who thinks no woman is good enough for her son. I smiled back, shook her hand, and sat down to brunch, determined to give this woman a fair chance. Over the next several months, I tried. I really, genuinely tried to like Jessica. I invited her to Sunday dinners. I asked about her job, which seemed vague and always changing. Sometimes she was in marketing. Sometimes she was consulting. Sometimes she was between opportunities, which I assumed meant unemployed, though she never seemed short on money. I complimented her clothes, her hair, the expensive purses she carried that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. I asked about her family. Her parents lived on the main line, old money, the kind of people who summered in Martha's Vineyard and wintered in Palm Beach. Her father was something in finance. Her mother sat on charity boards and planned fundraisers. Jessica had gone to Penn State, been in a sorority, studied communications, graduated, and then sort of floated from one thing to another without ever really settling into a career. None of that bothered me. Not everyone has their life figured out by 30. What bothered me were the small things, the tiny cuts that individually meant nothing but together started to form a pattern. The way she'd correct me in front of Daniel. We'd be having dinner, and I'd say something, just casual conversation, and Jessica would interrupt with this sweet smile and say, "Actually, Margaret, I think you mean this, not that. Or the proper word is this, not what you just said." Always gentle, always with a smile, but always in front of Daniel. Never when we were alone. The way she'd suggest Daniel deserved better things than what he had. We were at his apartment once, and she picked up this watch I'd given him for his college graduation, a Timex I'd saved up for months to buy, and she said, "Honey, don't you think it's time you upgraded to something more professional? A man in your position should really wear a proper timepiece." She said it like the watch I'd given him was something to be embarrassed about, like it wasn't good enough for the life she envisioned for him. The way she slowly, methodically started cutting me out of my son's life. Sundays had been our day for 26 years. Since Thomas died, Daniel and I had spent almost every Sunday together. It was sacred time, the one constant in both our lives. Within 3 months of dating Jessica, that tradition started to crumble. Suddenly there were brunches with Jessica's parents that always seemed to fall on Sunday mornings, vineyard tours in Bucks County on Sunday afternoons, charity luncheons and networking events and couples activities that all somehow had to happen on Sundays. Daniel would call me apologetically. "Mom, I'm so sorry, but Jessica's parents invited us to their club for brunch, and I really need to make a good impression." Mom, I know we usually do dinner, but Jessica got these tickets to this thing, and we can reschedule for next week, right? Except next week there'd be another excuse, and then another, and pretty soon, our weekly Sunday dinners became bi-weekly, then monthly, then whenever he could fit me into his increasingly busy schedule. And I said nothing. I smiled and told him it was fine, that I understood, that of course he needed to prioritize his relationship. Because what else could I say? That I was jealous of his girlfriend? That I felt like I was losing my son? That would have made me exactly the kind of overbearing mother I was terrified of becoming. Then in December of 2022, Daniel called me on a Tuesday evening. "Mom," he said, his voice shaking with excitement. She said yes. "I proposed to Jessica tonight at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, right on the steps where Dad proposed to you, and she said yes. We're getting married." I felt this wave of emotions crash over me all at once. Happiness, because my son was happy. Sadness, because this was really happening. He was really starting a life that wouldn't include me in the same way. And something else, something I couldn't quite name at the time but later recognized as dread. A cold, creeping sense that something about this was wrong. But I pushed it down and said all the right things. "Oh, honey, that's wonderful. Congratulations, I'm so happy for you both. She's a lucky woman." When I hung up the phone, I sat in my kitchen for over an hour, staring at nothing, trying to understand why I felt like crying instead of celebrating. 3 days before Daniel called with his engagement news, something happened that I didn't tell him about. I was at a nursing conference at the Pennsylvania Convention Center, one of those professional development things my hospital made us attend once a year. During the lunch break, I was in line at the coffee station when I heard someone say my name. I turned around, and there was this young woman, Asian, probably early 30s, wearing scrubs from Pennsylvania Hospital. She introduced herself as Amy Chen, said she was a nurse in their cardiac unit. We started chatting the way nurses do, comparing horror stories about difficult patients and incompetent doctors. Then she asked where I worked, and I told her, County General. She asked my last name, and when I said Sullivan, her whole face changed. "Wait," she said, "are you Daniel Sullivan's mother?" I was surprised because I didn't know how this stranger would know my son. "Yes," I said. "Do you know Daniel?" She hesitated, looking around the crowded conference hall like she was deciding whether to say something. Then she leaned in close and said, "I don't know Daniel personally, but I know Jessica Mitchell. We were roommates at Penn State for 2 years. I heard through mutual friends that she's dating someone named Daniel Sullivan, and I thought maybe I should." She trailed off, clearly uncomfortable. I felt my heart rate pick up. "What about Jessica?" I asked. Amy looked around again, then suggested we take our coffee outside, where it was quieter. We walked out to a bench near the convention center and sat down. "Mrs. Sullivan," Amy began. "I don't know your son and I don't want to interfere in his life, but if Jessica is serious about him, there are some things you should probably know." She proceeded to tell me about living with Jessica during their sophomore and junior years at Penn State. How Jessica had always been focused on finding a wealthy boyfriend. How she'd openly talked about using her looks to attract men who could give her the lifestyle she wanted. How she'd had multiple older boyfriends while in college, men in their 40s and 50s who'd buy her things and take her on trips. How she'd bragged to Amy and their other roommates about getting these men to pay for everything, her rent, her tuition, her credit card bills, all while keeping them separate from each other, so none of them knew about the others. Amy told me that Jessica had failed out of most of her classes because she was too busy managing these relationships, and that she'd only graduated because one of her professors, who she'd been sleeping with, had changed her grades. I sat there on that bench, coffee going cold in my hands, listening to Amy describe a person I didn't recognize. "That can't be the same, Jessica," I said. "The woman my son is dating is sweet and kind and loves him." Amy gave me this sad, knowing look. "Mrs. Sullivan," she said, "Jessica is very good at being whoever she needs to be for whoever she's with. That's her skill. That's how she's always operated. I'm not saying she's a bad person exactly, but I am saying that in the 2 years I lived with her, I never once saw her date someone because she actually cared about them. It was always transactional, always about what they could do for her." I asked if she'd stayed in touch with Jessica after college. She said no, that they'd had a falling out senior year after Amy confronted her about the professor thing, and Jessica had cut her off completely. But she said she still had mutual friends from their sorority who kept her updated on Jessica's life, and that from what she'd heard, Jessica hadn't changed. She was still doing the same thing she'd done in college, just with more expensive targets. I didn't know what to do with this information. On one hand, this was secondhand gossip from someone who clearly didn't like Jessica and hadn't even spoken to her in years. On the other hand, Amy had no reason to lie to me. She didn't know me. She didn't know Daniel. She had nothing to gain from telling me this, except maybe easing her own conscience. I thanked her for telling me and asked if she'd be willing to talk to me again if I had questions. She gave me her phone number and email address. Then she said something I'll never forget. "Mrs. Sullivan, I hope I'm wrong about Jessica. I hope she's changed and your son is going to have a wonderful marriage. But if you start seeing signs that she's not who she pretends to be, please don't ignore them." I ignored them with our friend group in college because I didn't want to believe someone could be that manipulative. And I watched her hurt a lot of people before I finally said something. "Just keep your eyes open. That's all I'm asking." So when Daniel called 3 days later to tell me he was engaged, Amy's words were echoing in my head. Keep your eyes open. And I decided that's exactly what I would do. I would watch. I would pay attention. And if Jessica really was the person Amy described, eventually she'd slip up. Eventually I'd see the truth. What I didn't know then was that the truth would reveal itself much sooner than I expected, and in a way I never could have imagined. Because 4 weeks after that engagement announcement, on February 8th, 2023, my son's 32nd birthday, I would walk into an upscale French restaurant and see something that would confirm every single word Amy Chen had told me. And more. February 8th, 2023 started like any other Wednesday. I woke up at 6 in the morning, made coffee, did the crossword puzzle from the Philadelphia Inquirer, and got ready for a regular day off from the hospital. I'd requested the day off weeks in advance because it was Daniel's 32nd birthday and we'd planned to have lunch together, just the two of us, before he went to his dinner with Jessica that evening. He'd made reservations at Vernick Food and Drink, this upscale place in Center City that he'd been trying to get into for months. Jessica had apparently been excited about it, had bought a new dress specifically for the occasion, had made a big deal about how special she was going to make his birthday. So I was planning to see him for a quick birthday lunch, give him his present, and then send him off to enjoy his evening with his fiancée. We met at noon at this little sandwich place near his office in Center City. I gave him his present, a new leather messenger bag for work, because his old one was falling apart. Nothing expensive, maybe $80 from a department store, but something I knew he needed and would use. He loved it, hugged me tight, thanked me like I'd given him something worth $1,000. That was Daniel, always grateful, always appreciative of even the smallest gestures. We ate sandwiches and talked about work, about the wedding planning, about how Jessica's mother was driving everyone crazy with her opinions about flower arrangements and seating charts. He seemed happy, but also a little stressed, which I attributed to normal wedding planning anxiety. He mentioned that tonight's dinner was really important to Jessica, that she'd made such a big deal about celebrating together, just the two of them. I told him to have a wonderful time, kissed him goodbye, and went home feeling content that my son was happy and loved. At 5:47 that evening, my phone rang. It was Daniel. The moment I heard his voice, I knew something was wrong. He sounded flat, disappointed in a way that made my mother's heart clench. "Mom," he said, "tonight's dinner got canceled. Jessica just texted me. Her grandmother in Miami had a fall, broke her hip, and Jessica's catching a flight down there in a few hours. She feels terrible about missing my birthday, but family emergency, you know?" I could hear him trying to convince himself it was okay, trying to be understanding and supportive like he always was. "Of course she has to go," he told me. "Her grandmother raised her. She's really close to her. I can't be upset about that. Family comes first." Those words, "family comes first," coming from my son about a woman who was at that very moment lying to him, made me feel physically ill, even though I didn't know yet that she was lying. I told Daniel I was sorry, that we could celebrate together if he wanted, maybe order pizza and watch a movie like we used to when he was younger. He said no, that he was just going to stay home, maybe catch up on work, go to bed early. He sounded so defeated. I hung up feeling terrible for him, angry at Jessica for canceling on his birthday, even though I believed at that moment that she had a legitimate reason. I sat on my couch, stewing about it for maybe 20 minutes, getting increasingly upset that my son was going to spend his birthday alone. Then I remembered something. Back in November, one of my patients, an elderly woman I'd taken care of during a difficult recovery, had given me a gift certificate to Le Bernardin as a thank you. It was for $200, an incredibly generous gift that I'd tucked away in my desk drawer because I had no idea when I'd ever use it. Le Bernardin was one of those fancy French restaurants that people like me didn't go to, where entrees cost $50 and you needed a reservation weeks in advance. But it was my son's birthday, and he deserved something special. So I pulled out the gift certificate, checked the expiration date, saw it was good for another 2 weeks, and called Daniel back. "Honey," I said, "I just remembered I have this gift certificate to Le Bernardin that a patient gave me, and it's about to expire. Why don't we use it tonight? Just you and me. We'll have a fancy birthday dinner together." He hesitated. He said he wasn't really in the mood, that he'd probably be bad company. I pushed gently. "Come on," I said. "When was the last time we went somewhere nice together? Let me take my son out for his birthday." He finally agreed, probably more to make me happy than because he actually wanted to go. We made plans to meet at the restaurant at 7:45. I hung up and immediately panicked about what to wear because I owned nothing appropriate for a place like Le Bernardin. I ended up in the same blouse I'd worn to meet Jessica for the first time, paired with black slacks and the only pair of nice shoes I owned. Good enough. Le Bernardin was in Rittenhouse Square, one of the fanciest neighborhoods in Philadelphia. I arrived 10 minutes early, gave the hostess our name, and waited near the entrance, feeling completely out of place among the well-dressed clientele. Daniel showed up right on time, wearing a button-down shirt and slacks, looking handsome but tired. The hostess seated us at a table near the back of the restaurant, away from the windows, which was fine with me because I felt less exposed there. The menu had no prices, which I'd heard was a thing at expensive restaurants but had never actually experienced. Everything was in French, with English descriptions underneath. Daniel ordered something I couldn't pronounce. I got the simplest thing I could find, some kind of fish that the waiter assured me was excellent. We ordered a bottle of wine because it was a special occasion and Daniel needed cheering up. The first 30 minutes were nice. We talked about his work, about a project he was leading that was going well. We talked about his memories of birthdays past, about the year his father took him to a Phillies game and they got seats right behind home plate. We talked about everything except Jessica and the canceled dinner, which hung between us like something we were both trying to ignore. Around 8:15, I excused myself to use the restroom. I stood up, grabbed my purse, and headed toward the back of the restaurant, where I'd seen signs for the restrooms earlier. To get there, I had to walk through the bar area, a dimly lit space with high-top tables and a long marble bar where well-dressed people sipped cocktails and talked in low voices. I was walking past, not really paying attention to anyone, when something made me glance to my left at one of the corner booths. Time did this strange thing, where it seemed to stop completely. My brain registered what I was seeing but couldn't process it, like when you see something so out of context that it doesn't make sense at first. Sitting in a private corner booth, partially hidden by a decorative screen, but not hidden enough, was Jessica, my son's fiancée, the woman who was supposed to be on a plane to Miami to see her injured grandmother. She was here, in Philadelphia, at Le Bernardin, 20 feet away from where her fiancé was sitting, having dinner with his mother. She was wearing a black dress I'd never seen before, something expensive looking and low cut. Her hair was down, styled in soft waves. She had on more makeup than usual, dramatic and sophisticated. And sitting across from her, reaching across the table to hold her hand, was a man I'd never seen before. He was older, probably mid to late 50s, with silver hair perfectly styled, wearing a suit that even I could tell was expensive. He had a Rolex on his wrist that caught the candlelight from their table, and the way he was looking at her, the way his hand covered hers on the table, the way she was leaning toward him with this smile I'd never seen her give Daniel, none of it was appropriate for a business dinner or a friendly meal. This was intimate. This was romantic. This was exactly what it looked like, and what it looked like made my blood run cold. I immediately ducked behind a decorative column, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I told myself I was wrong, that this couldn't be Jessica, that my eyes were playing tricks on me in the dim lighting. But I looked again, carefully, and there was no mistaking it. That was absolutely Jessica Mitchell, and she was absolutely on a date with a man who was not my son. I stood there frozen behind that column for probably 90 seconds, watching them. I watched him brush her cheek with his fingers in a gesture that was clearly familiar, not a first date move but something practiced and comfortable. I watched her lean into his touch and smile, that same sultry smile she'd given Daniel when they first started dating. I watched him lift her hand to his lips and kiss it while maintaining eye contact with her. I watched her giggle. Actually giggle like a teenager, in a way I'd never seen her behave with Daniel. And I watched her reach across the table with her other hand to touch his face, her engagement ring, the ring my son had saved for months to buy her, catching the light as her hand moved. I felt like I was going to be sick right there in the middle of this expensive restaurant. Every instinct screamed at me to march over to that table and confront her, to demand to know what she was doing, to drag her out to the main dining room and show Daniel exactly who he was planning to marry. But I didn't do any of those things. Instead, I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and opened the camera. I made sure the flash was off and the sound was muted, and I took 3 photos from behind my column, zooming in as much as I could without losing clarity. One of them holding hands across the table, one of him touching her face, one of her leaning into him with that smile. The lighting wasn't perfect and I was shooting from an angle, but the photos were clear enough to show who was in them, clear enough to show the intimacy between them, clear enough to prove what I was seeing wasn't innocent. Then I put my phone away, took several deep breaths to steady myself, and forced myself to walk to the restroom like that was what I'd been planning to do all along. I couldn't let Jessica see me. I couldn't risk her knowing I'd seen her because I needed to think, needed to figure out what to do with this information. I locked myself in a restroom stall and stood there shaking, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. My mind was racing through possibilities. Maybe it wasn't what it looked like. Maybe this man was a relative, an uncle or a family friend. Maybe there was an innocent explanation for why Jessica had lied about going to Miami and was instead having dinner with another man. But even as I tried to convince myself of these possibilities, I knew they were nonsense. You don't touch a relative like that. You don't look at a family friend like that. And you definitely don't lie to your fiancé about a family emergency to have an innocent dinner with someone. This was an affair. Jessica was cheating on my son, on his birthday, while he sat in the next room having dinner with his mother, disappointed that his fiancé had to cancel on him. She was 20 feet away on a date with another man. I stayed in that bathroom for maybe 5 minutes, trying to compose myself, trying to figure out what to do. I looked at the photos I'd taken. They were grainy and dark but unmistakably showed Jessica with this man. I thought about going straight to Daniel, showing him the photos, taking him to that bar area, and letting him see for himself. But then what? A confrontation in the middle of a restaurant? A scene in public? Daniel being humiliated and devastated on his birthday? I couldn't do that to him. Not here, not like this. So I made a decision that I would later question 1,000 times. I decided to say nothing. Not yet. Not until I knew more. Not until I had enough proof that Jessica couldn't talk her way out of it. Because I knew my son. I knew that if I showed him these photos and told him what I'd seen, he would want to believe the best of Jessica. He would listen to her explanations, and she would have explanations. She was smart and manipulative, and she'd find a way to make this seem innocent or turn it around on me. I washed my hands, checked my reflection in the mirror to make sure I looked normal, and walked back to our table. I deliberately took a route that wouldn't pass the bar area because I couldn't risk seeing them again, couldn't trust myself not to react. When I got back to the table, Daniel looked up at me with concern. "You okay, Mom? You look pale." I forced a smile and lied to my son for the first time in his life about something that mattered. "I'm fine, honey. Just felt a little dizzy for a second. Low blood sugar, probably. I should have eaten something before we came." He immediately became concerned, wanted to order me bread or appetizers, but I waved him off and said I was fine now that I was sitting down. We continued our dinner. Daniel talked about wedding plans, about how Jessica wanted a string quartet for the ceremony, about how her parents were contributing $50,000 to the wedding budget, which was generous but also meant her mother felt entitled to make all the decisions. I sat there nodding and smiling and making appropriate responses while internally screaming, while knowing that 20 feet away, the woman he was planning to marry was being romanced by another man, while carrying photos on my phone that would destroy his happiness if I showed them to him. The food tasted like cardboard in my mouth. The wine turned sour. Every word Daniel said about Jessica, about their future together, about how lucky he was to have found her, felt like a knife twisting in my chest. But I kept my face neutral and my voice steady and played the role of the supportive mother celebrating her son's birthday. We finished dinner around 9:30. Daniel insisted on paying despite my protests, said it was his birthday and he wanted to treat me for once. We walked out of the restaurant together. He hugged me goodbye and thanked me for salvaging his birthday. I told him I loved him and to drive safe. And then I watched him walk to his car and drive away, completely unaware that his fiancée had just spent the evening with another man. I didn't go home. Instead, I walked back toward Le Bernardin, staying on the opposite side of the street, partially hidden by parked cars and other pedestrians. I felt ridiculous, like some kind of amateur spy, but I needed to know. I needed to see what happened next. I found a spot where I could see the restaurant entrance without being too obvious, and I waited. It was February in Philadelphia, cold enough that my breath made clouds in the air, but I barely felt it. I was running on pure adrenaline and fury. At 9:42, they came out. Jessica and the silver-haired man. He had his arm around her waist in a way that was possessive and familiar. She was laughing at something he'd said, leaning into him. They walked together down the street, not hiding, not concerned about being seen. Why would they be? Jessica had told Daniel she was in Miami. She had no reason to think anyone who knew her would see her here. I followed them, staying far enough back that they wouldn't notice me, but close enough that I didn't lose them in the evening pedestrian traffic. They walked 2 blocks down Walnut Street, and then turned into the Meridian Hotel. The Meridian was one of those luxury hotels in Rittenhouse Square, where rooms probably cost $400 a night minimum. I watched through the glass doors as they walked through the lobby together, as he put his hand on the small of her back and guided her toward the elevators, as they got into an elevator and the doors closed. I stood outside on the cold street, staring at that hotel, and I knew exactly what was happening. I knew that Jessica had lied to my son about a family emergency so she could spend his birthday with another man. I knew that she was at this moment in a hotel room with that man doing things I didn't want to think about. And I knew that if I didn't stop this, if I didn't find a way to show Daniel the truth, he was going to marry this woman. I got into my car, which was parked 3 blocks away, and drove back to the hotel. I parked across the street where I had a clear view of the entrance. And I waited. I'm not even sure what I was waiting for, what I thought I would accomplish by sitting there. But I couldn't make myself leave. I sat in my 15-year-old Honda Civic with the heat running, watching that hotel entrance, checking the time on my phone every few minutes. 10 o'clock passed. 11 o'clock. Midnight. I thought about Daniel at home in his apartment, probably watching TV or reading, thinking his fiancée was in Miami taking care of her grandmother, completely trusting and completely deceived. I thought about calling him, telling him everything, but what would I say? I saw Jessica at a restaurant with another man, and then they went to a hotel together? He would ask questions I couldn't answer. Who was the man? How did I know it wasn't innocent? Why didn't I say something at the restaurant? And Jessica would have explanations. She was brilliant at explanations. At 12:30 in the morning, I finally gave up and drove home. Jessica and the silver-haired man had not come out of that hotel, which meant they were staying the night. I drove home in a complete fog, my mind unable to process what I'd witnessed. I pulled into my driveway and sat there with the engine off, staring at my house, trying to figure out what to do next. I couldn't tell Daniel, not yet, not without more proof. But I couldn't say nothing and watch him marry someone who was betraying him so completely. I went inside, didn't bother turning on lights, just went straight to my bedroom and sat on the edge of my bed in the dark. I pulled out my phone and looked at the photos I'd taken again. They were damning, but not conclusive. A defense attorney or a manipulative fiancé could explain them away. Maybe that man was a client. Maybe it was a business dinner. Maybe the hotel was where they were meeting other people for drinks. Maybe. I needed more than maybe. At 2 in the morning, I finally accepted that I wasn't going to sleep. I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table staring at nothing. I thought about Amy Chen, Jessica's former roommate, and what she'd told me at that nursing conference. How Jessica had always been transactional in her relationships. How she'd used men for money and gifts and support. How she'd been skilled at being whoever she needed to be for whoever she was with. At the time, I'd wanted to dismiss Amy's warnings as gossip or bitterness. But now, having seen Jessica with my own eyes, having watched her lie to my son and betray him on his birthday, I knew Amy had been telling the truth. Jessica hadn't changed since college. She was still exactly who she'd always been. And my son, my kind, trusting, loyal son, had no idea who he was really engaged to. I picked up my phone and almost called Amy, almost reached out to ask for more information. But it was 2 in the morning and I didn't know her well enough for that. Instead, I called the one person I could always count on for honest, practical advice. My sister Patricia answered on the 4th ring, her voice thick with sleep. "Maggie? What's wrong? Is everything okay?" "I'm sorry for calling so late," I said. "I need to talk to you about something. Are you awake?" She said she was now, and asked what was going on. I told her everything. About Amy's warnings, about seeing Jessica at the restaurant, about following them to the hotel, about the photos on my phone, about Daniel being completely unaware that his fiancée had spent his birthday with another man. Patricia was silent for a long time after I finished talking. Then she asked the question I'd been asking myself all night. What are you going to do? I don't know, I admitted. If I tell Daniel, Jessica will deny it. She'll say it wasn't what it looked like, and he might believe her. Patricia made this thoughtful sound she always made when she was processing something complicated. Maggie, she said finally, you can't tell him yet. Not with what you have now. You need more. More what? I asked. More evidence, Patricia said. Her tone shifted into lawyer mode, practical and strategic. Right now you have 3 grainy photos and a story about seeing them at a hotel. That's not nothing, but it's also not conclusive. Jessica can explain it away. She can make you look paranoid or jealous, or like you've been trying to sabotage their relationship from the start. If you're going to do this, if you're going to potentially blow up your son's engagement, you need evidence that can't be disputed. You need proof that's so clear and so overwhelming that she can't talk her way out of it. I asked her what kind of proof she meant. She suggested I hire a private investigator, someone who could follow Jessica professionally, document her activities, find out who this man was and how long this had been going on. I immediately rejected the idea. I can't afford a private investigator, I told her. Those people charge hundreds of dollars an hour. Patricia reminded me that I couldn't afford not to know the truth. She said if Daniel married Jessica and later found out she'd been cheating, the divorce would cost him far more than an investigator would cost me. We talked for another hour, going through options, discussing strategy. Patricia made me promise I wouldn't confront Jessica or tell Daniel anything until I had more information. She made me promise I would at least talk to a private investigator, just to find out what it would cost and what they could do. She reminded me that I'd worked too hard and sacrificed too much to raise Daniel into the man he was, and that I owed it to him to protect him from someone who would hurt him. When we finally hung up, it was almost 4 a.m. I was exhausted but wired, running on adrenaline and maternal rage. I went to my computer and started searching for private investigators in Philadelphia. I found dozens of them, all with websites promising discretion and professionalism and results. I had no idea how to choose one, or what questions to ask, or even if I could really afford to do this. But Patricia was right about one thing. I couldn't let my son marry Jessica without knowing the truth. I couldn't watch him make the biggest mistake of his life and do nothing to stop it. So I made a list of 5 investigators with good reviews and decided I would call them in the morning. I would find out what it would cost. And then I would figure out how to pay for it, even if it meant emptying what little retirement savings I had left. Because my son's future was worth more than my retirement fund. His happiness was worth more than my security. And the truth, whatever it turned out to be, was worth whatever price I had to pay to find it. The morning after Daniel's birthday, I woke up at 6 after maybe 2 hours of sleep. I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table with the list of private investigators I'd compiled at 4 a.m. 5 names, all with good online reviews, all promising discretion and results. I had no idea how to choose between them or what questions I should even be asking. I'd never hired anyone like this before. The closest I'd ever come to investigative work was watching crime documentaries on television. But I couldn't let my inexperience stop me. So I started at the top of my list and began making phone calls. The first 2 investigators I spoke with were professional but expensive. One quoted me $3,000 up front, plus $200 per hour for surveillance. The other wanted $5,000 as a retainer and wouldn't guarantee any results. The third investigator sounded like he was running his business out of a bar, with background noise so loud I could barely hear him. I crossed him off immediately. The 4th call I made was to a man named Robert Chen. His website was simple and professional, with testimonials from satisfied clients and a biography that mentioned 20 years with the Philadelphia Police Department before retiring to private investigation. When he answered the phone, his voice was calm and measured, immediately putting me at ease in a way the others hadn't. I told him I needed to discuss a potential case and asked if we could meet in person. He suggested a coffee shop in South Philadelphia, neutral territory, somewhere we could talk privately without drawing attention. We agreed to meet the next morning at 9. I spent the rest of that day in a fog, going through the motions of my normal routine, while my mind raced with thoughts of what I'd seen and what I was about to do. I kept checking my phone, half expecting Daniel to call and somehow know what I'd witnessed, but he didn't call. I thought about calling him just to hear his voice, but I was terrified I'd break down and tell him everything before I had real proof. Tuesday morning I drove to the coffee shop Robert had suggested, a small Italian place tucked into a neighborhood of row houses and corner stores. I arrived 15 minutes early, ordered a coffee I didn't drink, and sat at a table near the back trying to calm my nerves. At exactly 9 o'clock, a man walked in who I immediately knew was Robert Chen. He was probably in his early 60s, with salt and pepper hair cut short and kind eyes that seemed to take in everything about a room in seconds. He was wearing jeans and a button-down shirt, nothing flashy, completely unremarkable in a way that I later realized was probably intentional for someone in his line of work. He spotted me, walked over, and extended his hand. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said. "I'm Robert Chen. Thank you for meeting me." We shook hands and he sat down across from me, pulling out a small notebook and pen. "Before we start," he said, "I want you to know that everything you tell me is confidential. I don't share information with anyone unless you give me explicit permission, and I don't take cases unless I believe I can actually help. If what you're asking for is outside my capabilities or ethics, I'll tell you up front." I appreciated his directness. I took a deep breath and started talking. I told him about Daniel, about his engagement to Jessica, about my concerns that had been building over the past year. I told him about Amy Chen's warnings, about seeing Jessica at Le Bernardin on Daniel's birthday, about following them to the Méridien Hotel. I pulled out my phone and showed him the 3 photos I'd taken. Robert looked at them carefully, zooming in, studying the details. Then he asked permission to text the photos to himself so he could examine them more closely on his computer. I agreed. He studied the images for several minutes without speaking, his expression neutral and professional. Finally, he looked up. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said, "I'm going to ask you some direct questions, and I need you to answer honestly. First question, are you prepared for what I might find? If I investigate this woman and discover she's faithful to your son, will you accept that outcome?" I told him yes, that I genuinely hoped I was wrong, that I wanted nothing more than to discover there was an innocent explanation for what I'd seen. "Second question," Robert continued. "If I find evidence that confirms your suspicions, what do you plan to do with that information? Are you going to show it to your son? Are you looking for leverage? Are you trying to break them up?" I hadn't really thought that far ahead, but I told him the truth. I would show the evidence to Daniel and let him make his own decision about his relationship. I wasn't trying to control him or manipulate the situation. I just wanted him to have all the information before he made a permanent commitment to someone who might not be who she claimed to be. Robert nodded, seeming satisfied with my answer. "Third question," he said. "Are you prepared to potentially destroy your relationship with your son? Because if I find evidence and you show it to him, there's a chance he'll be angry at you for investigating his fiancée. There's a chance he'll choose her over you, at least initially. Are you prepared for that possibility?" The question hit me hard because I hadn't fully considered it. But I thought about it now, really thought about it, and realized that yes, I was prepared for that risk. I would rather have Daniel hate me and be free from a toxic relationship than have him love me while being trapped in a marriage built on lies. Robert seemed to respect that answer. He put down his notebook and leaned back in his chair. "All right," he said, "let me tell you what I can do and what it will cost. I specialize in surveillance and background investigation. If you hire me, I'll conduct comprehensive surveillance on Jessica Mitchell to document her activities, her associations, and her behavior patterns. I'll also run a complete background check, financial records where, legally accessible, online presence, everything I can find that might be relevant. I use video and photographic documentation with timestamps and GPS coordinates. Everything I provide you will be admissible in court if it ever comes to that. I work alone for most surveillance to keep costs down, but I contract with other investigators when I need additional coverage. My fees are $2,500 as a retainer to cover initial research and setup, then $2,000 per month for active surveillance, which includes my time, equipment, mileage, and documentation. If the investigation requires digital forensics or other specialists, those are additional costs that I'll quote you before proceeding." The numbers made my stomach drop. $2,500 upfront plus $2,000 per month. If this investigation took 3 months, that would be $8,500 total. If it took 6 months, that would be $14,500. I had about $18,000 in my retirement savings, money I'd been carefully building for over a decade. Using it for this would essentially wipe out my financial security. I must have looked stricken because Robert's expression softened. "I know it's expensive," he said quietly. "Most people are shocked when they hear the cost of a private investigation, but I want you to understand what you're paying for. You're paying for my expertise, my time, professional equipment, and most importantly, legally obtained evidence that can't be disputed. If I find something and you show it to your son, Jessica won't be able to claim the evidence was fabricated or obtained illegally. Everything I do is above board and documented, And Mrs. Sullivan, if your son marries this woman and you're right about her, the cost of a divorce will be far more than what I'm charging, both financially and emotionally." He was right, and I knew it. I thought about Daniel's future, about him potentially being trapped in a marriage with someone who was using him, cheating on him, lying to him every single day. I thought about him finding out years down the line when they had kids and shared assets and a life built on false foundations. I thought about the devastation that would cause, how it would break something fundamental in him. And I realized that my retirement fund, my security, my plans for the future, none of that mattered compared to protecting my son from that kind of pain. "Okay," I said. "When can you start?" Robert pulled out a contract from his messenger bag and walked me through it. Standard terms, confidentiality agreements, scope of work. I signed it with shaking hands and wrote him a check for $2,500. Money I transferred from my savings account that morning in anticipation of this meeting. Robert pocketed the check and shook my hand. "I'll start immediately," he said. "I need some information from you. Jessica's full name, date of birth if you know it, address, phone number, vehicle description, and license plate if you have it, and her typical schedule as far as you're aware of it." I gave him everything I knew. Jessica Marie Mitchell, born April 15, 1997, which made her 26 years old. She lived with Daniel at his apartment in Northern Liberties, a 2-bedroom condo he'd bought 3 years ago. I didn't know her phone number, but I knew she drove a white BMW sedan, though I couldn't remember the license plate. Her schedule was harder because she didn't seem to have regular employment. She'd told Daniel she was a freelance marketing consultant who worked from home, which meant she set her own hours. The only consistent pattern I knew about was that she had yoga classes on Wednesday afternoons and girls' nights on Monday and Thursday evenings, though I now suspected both of those were covers for other activities. Robert took notes on everything, asked clarifying questions, and created a basic profile. Then he pulled out his phone and did something that impressed me. Within 5 minutes, using just her name and date of birth, he'd found Jessica's social media profiles, her vehicle registration, which gave him the license plate, and several other public records I didn't even know existed. He showed me what he'd found. Jessica's Instagram account was public and filled with carefully curated photos. Pictures of her and Daniel at restaurants and events, always with captions about how blessed and happy she was. Pictures of her working out at expensive gyms, having brunches with girlfriends, attending charity events. Everything looked perfect and aspirational, the kind of life people scroll through in envy. But Robert pointed out things I hadn't noticed. "Look at the dates and times of her posts," he said. "She posts photos from dates with your son, but look at the metadata. This photo she posted claiming it was from last Friday night? The metadata shows it was actually taken 3 weeks ago. She's recycling old photos to make it look like she's with him more than she actually is. And look at these photos from what she calls girls' trips. See the reflections in the windows and mirrors? In several of them, you can see a man's reflection, someone who's been cropped out of the shot. Jessica wasn't just living a double life. She was documenting it on social media while pretending it was something else entirely." Robert explained his surveillance plan. He would follow Jessica for the next week to establish her baseline routine, document where she went, who she met, and what patterns emerged. He would use a combination of physical surveillance and digital tracking, where legal. He would photograph and video record her activities in public spaces. After 1 week, he'd compile a preliminary report and we'd meet again to discuss findings and determine whether to continue. He warned me that not every investigation produces dramatic results immediately. Sometimes people really are exactly who they claim to be. Sometimes suspicions are unfounded. He wanted me to be prepared for the possibility that Jessica might be faithful to Daniel, and my concerns might be paranoia. I appreciated his honesty, even though I knew in my gut that wasn't the case. We shook hands again, and Robert left the coffee shop to begin his work. I sat there alone for another 30 minutes, drinking my cold coffee, trying to process what I'd just set in motion. I'd hired a private investigator to spy on my son's fiancée. If Daniel ever found out, he would be horrified, furious, and possibly never forgive me. But if I was right about Jessica, this investigation might save him from the biggest mistake of his life. The next week was torture. I went to work at the hospital, came home, ate dinner alone, and waited for updates from Robert. He told me he would text brief status updates, but wouldn't call unless there was something urgent. Every day my phone would buzz with messages. Day 1, subject established at home, no activity. Day 2, subject went to gym, lunch with female friend, returned home. Day 3, subject went shopping, hair appointment, returned home. I started to wonder if I'd been wrong, if that night at Le Bernardin had been an aberration or a misunderstanding. Maybe Jessica really was faithful to Daniel, and I'd just seen her having an innocent dinner with a friend or colleague. Maybe I was destroying my savings and risking my relationship with my son based on one questionable observation. Then, on day 4, a Thursday, I got a different kind of text from Robert. Activity observed, will have full report tomorrow, recommend in-person meeting. I barely slept that night, anxiety and dread churning in my stomach. Friday morning I met Robert at the same coffee shop. He had a manila folder which he placed on the table between us. Before I open this, he said, I want to prepare you. What I found is going to be difficult to see. If you need to stop at any point, just tell me. I nodded, bracing myself. Robert opened the folder and pulled out a series of photographs, each one time-stamped and annotated with location data. The first photo showed Jessica leaving Daniel's apartment on Thursday evening at 6:15. She was wearing a black dress and heels, her hair and makeup done more elaborately than usual. According to Robert's notes, Daniel had texted her at 5:30 saying he'd be working late and not to wait up for him. The second photo showed Jessica arriving at Le Bernardin at 7:05. The third photo showed her meeting a man outside the restaurant, the same silver-haired man I'd seen her with on Daniel's birthday. His name, according to Robert's research, was Richard Westbrook, 54 years old, owner of Westbrook Development Group, a commercial real estate company. Married for 28 years with 3 adult children. The photos continued. Jessica and Richard entering the restaurant together. Robert had managed to get a table near theirs and had taken discreet photos of them during dinner. The images showed them holding hands across the table. Richard touching Jessica's face, Jessica leaning into him intimately. Their body language was unmistakable. This wasn't a business dinner or a friendly meal. This was romantic, sexual, familiar. Robert's notes indicated they spent 2 hours at dinner, during which Richard paid the bill with a credit card. Robert had contacts who could access certain transaction records and confirmed that Richard had spent $647 on that dinner. After dinner, the photos showed them walking to the Meridian Hotel, the same hotel I'd seen them go to on Daniel's birthday. They entered at 9:20. Robert had stayed outside the hotel conducting surveillance. At 11:50, Jessica emerged alone, hair disheveled, makeup smudged, wearing the same dress but carrying her heels in her hand. She got into an Uber, which Robert followed back to Daniel's apartment. She arrived home at 12:30 in the morning. I stared at these photos, feeling physically sick. This wasn't a one-time thing. This was a pattern. Jessica had done this on Daniel's birthday, and she'd done it again yesterday, probably had been doing it regularly for months or longer. Robert pulled out more photos from earlier in the week, images I hadn't seen yet. On Wednesday afternoon, Jessica had gone to an apartment building in Northern Liberties. According to Robert's research, the apartment belonged to Kyle Torres, a 26-year-old personal trainer who worked at Lifetime Fitness, the same gym where Jessica had her membership. Robert had photographed Jessica entering the building at 2:15 in the afternoon, wearing yoga pants and a tank top, carrying a gym bag. She emerged at 5:45 wearing different clothes, jeans and a t-shirt, her hair wet like she'd showered. Robert's notes indicated this was the same time slot when Jessica told Daniel she had yoga classes. She wasn't taking yoga. She was spending 3.5 hours at a young personal trainer's apartment and then showering before going home to my son. But Robert wasn't finished. He pulled out another set of photos from the previous Friday, before he'd officially started surveillance, but after our initial meeting. He'd begun preliminary observation and had followed Jessica that weekend when she told Daniel she was going to a spa retreat in the Poconos with her college girlfriends. Robert's photos showed Jessica meeting a man at a Wawa parking lot off Interstate 76. The man was driving a Range Rover. Jessica got into his vehicle with an overnight bag, and they drove together to a cabin in the Pocono Mountains. Robert had followed them, documented the location, and identified the man as Dr. Andrew Sutton, a 41-year-old cardiologist at Jefferson Hospital. Divorced, no children, owner of a vacation cabin where he apparently brought Jessica for romantic weekends. Robert had photos of them hiking together, sitting on the cabin's deck, kissing beside a lake. He'd documented Jessica's car remaining in that Wawa parking lot all weekend while she was with Dr. Sutton. She returned Sunday evening, retrieved her car, and drove home to Daniel's apartment, where she presumably told him all about her relaxing spa weekend with the girls. I couldn't speak. I sat there looking at photo after photo, each one more damning than the last, each one confirming that my son's fiancée was living an entirely separate life that he knew nothing about. How many men? I finally asked. Robert's expression was grim. Based on 1 week of surveillance, I've identified 3 regular contacts: Richard Westbrook, Kyle Torres, and Dr. Andrew Sutton. Monday and Thursday evenings appear to be reserved for Westbrook. Wednesday afternoons for Torres. Every other weekend for Sutton. But Mrs. Sullivan, there's more. He pulled out printed screenshots from a website I didn't recognize. Seeking Arrangement, the header read. Robert explained that it was a platform where young, attractive women connected with wealthy older men for mutually beneficial relationships, which was a polite way of saying it was a place where men paid women for companionship and sex. Jessica had an active profile on the site under the username honeyv_Philly. Robert had used completely legal methods to access her public profile, which was surprisingly detailed. Her profile photos showed Jessica in expensive dresses and designer clothes, posing in upscale locations. Her bio described her as sophisticated, educated, and selective, looking for a generous gentleman who appreciates the finer things in life. She specified she was interested in mutually beneficial arrangements only. No games, no drama. Her profile indicated she'd been a member for 4 years, since she was 22 years old, and had over 300 messages in her inbox. Robert had managed to access some of her public interactions on the platform through digital forensics methods he assured me were legal, if ethically questionable. The messages showed Jessica negotiating terms with various men. $500 for a dinner date, $2,000 for an overnight stay, $5,000 for a weekend trip. She was systematic and professional about it, treating these arrangements like business transactions. And based on the volume of messages and the dates of her confirmed meetings, Robert estimated she'd been doing this throughout her entire relationship with Daniel, possibly seeing dozens of different men over the past 2.5 years. The evidence was overwhelming. Jessica wasn't just cheating on Daniel. She was essentially operating as a high-end escort while using her relationship with my son as a cover story for legitimacy. Daniel was the respectable engineer boyfriend who made her look like a normal woman in a committed relationship, while she continued seeing other men for money and gifts and support. Everything about their relationship, from her perspective, was transactional. I thought about all the expensive clothes and accessories she owned, items that supposedly came from her parents' allowance. Now I knew where that money really came from. I thought about her vague employment status, the freelance marketing consulting she claimed to do. That was just a cover story. Her real income came from these arrangements with wealthy men. And Daniel, my sweet trusting son, had no idea that the woman he loved and wanted to marry was lying to him about literally every aspect of her life. I looked up at Robert, tears streaming down my face. "What do I do?" I asked. "How do I tell him this? How do I show him that the woman he loves doesn't exist?" Robert's expression was sympathetic. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said gently, "I need to be very clear with you about something. If you show your son this evidence right now, Jessica will deny it. She's smart, and she's been successfully maintaining this double life for years. She'll have explanations. She'll say, I've fabricated the evidence or taken photos out of context. She'll claim the seeking arrangement profile is fake, that someone created it using her photos. She'll say, Richard Westbrook is a client or a family friend, that Kyle Torres is just her personal trainer, that Dr. Sutton is a friend going through a tough divorce who needed company. She'll twist everything to make you look like a jealous mother who's been trying to sabotage their relationship. And your son, who's in love with her and wants to believe the best, might choose to believe her explanations instead of accepting this evidence. I've seen it happen dozens of times. People will go to extraordinary lengths to avoid accepting a painful truth, especially when accepting it means their entire relationship was a lie. So what do you suggest? I asked. Robert leaned forward, his voice low and serious. You need more evidence. You need documentation so comprehensive and so overwhelming that there's no possible innocent explanation. Video footage, not just photos. Audio recordings where legal, financial records, showing deposits that correspond with her arrangements. Text messages and communications. Testimony from the men she's been seeing, if any of them are willing to talk. You need to build a case so airtight that when you finally present it to your son, Jessica can't talk her way out of it. And here's the hard part. Mrs. Sullivan. That's going to take time. Probably several more months of investigation. You're going to have to watch your son continue planning a wedding to this woman while knowing what she's really doing. You're going to have to smile through engagement parties and wedding planning meetings while carrying this knowledge. Can you do that? Can you wait that long for his sake? I thought about it. Really considered what he was asking. Could I watch Daniel spend the next several months excitedly planning his future with someone I knew was betraying him? Could I sit through family dinners and wedding preparations while knowing the truth? The alternative was to tell him now with incomplete evidence and risk him not believing me, risk Jessica convincing him I was lying, risk losing my son forever while he stayed with her anyway. Or worse, risk him believing me, but still marrying her because he loved her and wanted to give her a chance to change. I'd heard of that happening. Partners forgiving infidelity and trying to make it work, especially when they were already invested in wedding plans and a future together. If I told Daniel now, he might be angry enough at Jessica to confront her but not angry enough to actually leave her. He might go to couples counseling with her, might convince himself that he could fix her or save their relationship. And then I would have shown my hand for nothing. Jessica would know I was onto her, and she'd be even more careful going forward. No, Robert was right. If I was going to do this, I needed to do it properly. I needed evidence so comprehensive that Daniel would have no choice but to see Jessica for exactly who she was. So I told Robert to continue the investigation. I wrote him another check for $2,000 to cover the next month of surveillance, and I made the hardest decision of my life. I would wait, I would watch, I would gather evidence, and I would say nothing until I had everything I needed to save my son. Robert Chen's investigation continued through March, April, and May of 2023. Every week, he sent me detailed reports that made my previous discoveries look almost innocent by comparison. The pattern was consistent and methodical. Monday and Thursday evenings, Jessica met Richard Westbrook. They'd have dinner at expensive restaurants, always places where they were unlikely to run into anyone from Daniel's social circle, then spend 3 to 4 hours at the Meridian Hotel. Robert had obtained credit card records through his contacts, showing that Richard had paid for hotel rooms 43 times over a 6-month period. Wednesday afternoons belonged to Kyle Torres, the personal trainer. Jessica would arrive at his apartment building at 2 in the afternoon and leave around 5:30, always showering before she left based on her wet hair in the surveillance photos. Every other Friday evening through Sunday, she was with Dr. Andrew Sutton at his Pocono cabin. Robert had compiled enough video footage of them together that there was no possible innocent explanation. Hiking, cooking together, kissing on the deck, behaving exactly like a couple on a romantic getaway. But the investigation revealed things even worse than the affairs. In mid-April, Robert discovered that Jessica had opened a credit card in Daniel's name without his knowledge or permission. She'd forged his signature on the application with enough skill that it had been approved. The card had a $15,000 limit, and she'd already charged nearly $8,000 to it, primarily for hotel rooms when she was with her various men. Daniel had no idea this card existed. It wouldn't show up on his credit report for another billing cycle. And by then they'd be married, and the debt would become his legal responsibility. Robert documented everything, obtained copies of the fraudulent application, tracked every charge Jessica had made. This wasn't just infidelity anymore. This was identity theft and fraud. My son could have legal and financial consequences from this woman's actions, even if he never married her. Then in early May, Robert called me with news that made me physically ill. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said, his voice gentle in that way people use when they're about to deliver devastating information. "I need to tell you something that Jessica did last month. In late April, she visited a women's health clinic in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. Based on records I was able to access through legal channels, she had an abortion. She was approximately 8 weeks pregnant at the time. I sat down hard in my kitchen chair, the room spinning around me." Robert continued speaking. "Based on the timeline and the surveillance data, the pregnancy most likely resulted from her relationship with Kyle Torres. There's no evidence she ever told your son she was pregnant. She simply handled it quietly and never mentioned it to anyone." I asked Robert how he could possibly know this, and he explained that he had contacts in medical billing who could access certain non-confidential treatment records. He was careful to stay within legal boundaries, but the evidence was clear. Jessica had been pregnant with another man's child and had terminated the pregnancy without ever telling Daniel. I thought about all the times in recent months when Daniel had mentioned wanting children, how excited he was about starting a family after the wedding. Jessica would smile and agree, talking about how many kids they should have, what they'd name them, how she couldn't wait to be a mother, all while she'd secretly terminated a pregnancy because the father was her personal trainer, not her fiancé. The level of deception was staggering. Every single aspect of Jessica's life was a performance. She had become so skilled at compartmentalizing and lying that she could look my son in the eyes and talk about their future children while having recently aborted another man's baby. I asked Robert how much more evidence we needed. He said we had more than enough to prove infidelity and fraud, but he recommended continuing surveillance through the wedding date to ensure there were no gaps in the timeline that Jessica could exploit. We needed to show this was ongoing, continuous, systematic betrayal, not isolated incidents she could explain away. So I continued to write checks to Robert Chen every month. $2,000 in March, $2,000 in April, $2,000 in May. By the end of May, I'd spent over $12,000 on the investigation, nearly wiping out my retirement savings. But the evidence we'd gathered was comprehensive and irrefutable. Robert had compiled everything into a detailed report with hundreds of pages of documentation, photos, videos, financial records, and timeline analysis. He'd created a presentation-style video that laid out the evidence in chronological order, showing Jessica's pattern of deception over the entire course of her relationship with Daniel. The video was devastating. It started with her seeking arrangement profile and messages, then showed surveillance footage of her with each of the 3 main men in her life, then revealed the credit card fraud, then showed the medical records from the abortion. Everything was time-stamped and annotated. There was no way to watch that video and conclude anything except that Jessica Mitchell was a con artist who'd been using my son for 2.5 years. The wedding was scheduled for June 14th. As that date approached, I struggled with the question of when and how to reveal what I knew. Every instinct screamed at me to tell Daniel immediately, to sit him down in my living room and show him everything Robert had found. But I kept thinking about what Robert and Patricia had both warned me. If I showed Daniel this evidence in private, Jessica would have the opportunity to spin it. She'd cry, she'd apologize, she'd claim the surveillance was taken out of context or that I'd hired someone to frame her because I'd never liked her. She'd say the abortion was from a previous relationship before she met Daniel. She'd claim the credit card was a misunderstanding. She was brilliant at manipulation, and she'd had years of practice. There was a real possibility that Daniel, devastated and confused, might choose to believe her explanations over the evidence. Or worse, he might believe the evidence, but still go through with the wedding, convinced he could fix her or save their relationship. Late May, around 2 a.m, I had a complete breakdown. I called Patricia sobbing so hard I could barely speak. "I can't do this anymore," I told her. "The wedding is 3 weeks away. I have to tell him. I can't watch him marry her knowing what I know." Patricia listened to me cry for several minutes before responding. "Maggie," she said gently, "I know this is torture. I know you're carrying an impossible burden. But you have to think strategically here. If you tell Daniel now, in private, what do you think happens? He confronts Jessica. She cries and denies and manipulates. Maybe he believes you, maybe he doesn't. But either way, it becomes he said, she said. It becomes your word and a private investigator's evidence against Jessica's tears and explanations. You give her the chance to control the narrative." Patricia paused, then continued. "What you need is witnesses. You need to expose her in a way that's so public and so undeniable that she can't manipulate what people saw with their own eyes. You need 200 people to see that evidence at the same time, so Jessica can't go around later claiming it was fake or taken out of context." "You mean expose her at the wedding?" I said. "Yes," Patricia confirmed. "I know it sounds cruel. I know it will humiliate Daniel in front of everyone he knows. But Maggie, think about the alternative. If you tell him privately, and he still marries her because she convinces him to give her another chance, you'll have lost your only opportunity to save him. And here's something else to consider. In Pennsylvania, the marriage license gets signed after the ceremony, but before the reception, usually during the cocktail hour. If you expose Jessica during the reception, before they sign that license, they're not legally married. No divorce needed. No asset division. No complicated legal proceedings. Daniel walks away completely free. But if you wait until after they're legally married, even if he leaves her the next day, there's still a divorce process. It's messier, more expensive, more painful. The timing matters." I sat there in my dark kitchen, phone pressed to my ear, realizing my sister was right. As cruel as it seemed, exposing Jessica publicly at her own wedding was actually the kindest thing I could do for Daniel in the long run. The next day, I made an appointment with Carmen Rodriguez, the wedding coordinator Jessica had hired. Carmen worked for an upscale event planning company that specialized in high-end weddings. She was professional, organized, and had been nothing but pleasant during the few times I'd interacted with her during the wedding planning process. I told her I wanted to discuss a special surprise for the reception, and she agreed to meet me at her office. When I arrived, Carmen welcomed me warmly and offered me coffee. I declined and got straight to the point. I told her I wanted to arrange a special video tribute to the bride and groom that would play during the reception. Carmen seemed delighted by the idea. She said it was a lovely gesture and asked if I'd already created the video or if I needed help with production. I told her I'd had it professionally produced and pulled a USB drive from my purse. This needs to play on all the ballroom screens at exactly 7:15 p.m., I said. Right after the toasts but before dinner is served. Can you make that happen? Carmen took the USB drive and asked if she should preview it to ensure the file format was compatible with their audio-visual system. I hesitated, knowing that if she watched the video, she'd immediately understand what I was planning and might refuse to cooperate. No, I said carefully. I've had it formatted specifically for professional presentation systems. It will work. I just prefer it to be a surprise for everyone, including the wedding staff. Carmen looked at me a bit strangely, her professional instincts clearly sensing something off about my request. Mrs. Sullivan, she said slowly, what exactly is in this video? I met her eyes and made a decision to be partially honest. It's information about the bride that my son needs to see before he signs the marriage license, I said. Information that will be difficult for him, but necessary. I'm asking you to trust me that I'm doing this for the right reasons. Carmen was quiet for a long moment, clearly torn between her professional obligation to her client and whatever she was reading in my expression. Finally, she said, if this video contains anything defamatory or illegal, I can't be part of it. My company could be liable. I assured her that everything in the video was true and legally obtained. I explained that I'd hired a licensed private investigator, that all surveillance was conducted in public spaces or with proper legal authority, and that I was willing to take full responsibility for any consequences. I'm not asking you to do anything wrong, I told Carmen. I'm asking you to play a video at a specified time. What happens after that is between my son and his fiancée. Carmen studied me for another long moment, then sighed. Against my better judgment, she said, I'll do it. But Mrs. Sullivan, I hope you know what you're doing, because what you're describing is going to devastate a lot of people. I know, I said quietly. But sometimes devastation is necessary to prevent something worse. Carmen put the USB drive in a locked drawer in her desk and wrote detailed notes about when to play it. We shook hands, and I left her office, my heart pounding with the realization that I'd just set everything in motion. There was no turning back now. The week before the wedding, Jessica invited me to lunch. The invitation came via text message, unusually warm and friendly. Hi Margaret, I'd love to take you to lunch this week, just the two of us. I feel like we haven't had much one-on-one time, and I'd really like to get to know you better before the wedding. Are you free Tuesday? I almost declined, because the thought of sitting across from her while knowing what I knew made me feel sick. But curiosity won out. I wanted to see what game she was playing, what she possibly had to say to me a week before her wedding. We met at a trendy bistro in Rittenhouse Square, the kind of place with small portions and big prices. Jessica was already seated when I arrived, looking flawless in a cream silk blouse and tailored pants, her engagement ring catching the light as she waved me over. We made awkward small talk while we ordered, discussing the weather and the final wedding preparations. Then, as our salads arrived, Jessica's demeanor shifted subtly. Margaret, she said, leaning forward with a practiced expression of concern. I wanted to talk to you about something important. About boundaries. I felt my jaw tighten, but kept my expression neutral. What kind of boundaries? I asked. Jessica dabbed her mouth with her napkin, a delicate gesture that somehow felt aggressive. Well, she said, Daniel and I are about to start our own family. We'll be building our own life together. And I need to make sure you understand that things are going to change. You won't be as central in his life as you've been. I'm not trying to be cruel, she continued, her voice honey-sweet and poisonous. But Daniel has mentioned how dependent you've been on him since his father passed, how you've leaned on him emotionally, how he's felt responsible for your happiness. And while I understand that's been your dynamic for a long time, it's not healthy. He needs space to be a husband and eventually a father. He needs to prioritize his new family, which means you'll need to step back. The audacity of it took my breath away. This woman who was systematically betraying and defrauding my son was lecturing me about healthy boundaries and family priorities. She was trying to preemptively cut me out of Daniel's life, to establish control before they were even married. I realized this lunch wasn't about getting to know me better. It was about Jessica asserting dominance, making sure I understood my place in the hierarchy of her new life. For a moment, I considered telling her everything right there, pulling out my phone and showing her the surveillance photos, describing in detail what Robert had discovered, watching her perfect facade crack. But I didn't. Instead, I smiled calmly and said, You're absolutely right, Jessica. Daniel deserves to build his own life with someone who truly loves him. Someone who's honest with him. Someone who respects him. Jessica blinked, uncertain how to read my tone. The words were agreeable, but something in my delivery made her hesitate. "I'm glad we understand each other," she finally said. "Oh, we do," I assured her. "We understand each other perfectly." We finished lunch with Jessica chattering about honeymoon plans and thank you cards and other wedding details. She insisted on paying for lunch, probably as another power move to demonstrate her financial superiority. As we left the restaurant, she gave me a brief hug and said how happy she was that we'd be family soon. I hugged her back and smiled, thinking about what would happen in just 4 days. 4 days until Jessica's carefully constructed world collapsed. 4 days until everyone saw her for exactly who she was. 4 days until my son was free. I drove home from that lunch feeling something I hadn't felt in months. Not dread or anxiety or guilt, but certainty. Jessica had just confirmed everything I needed to know. She had no remorse, no conscience, no genuine feeling for my son whatsoever. She was a predator, and Daniel was her prey. And in 4 days, at her own wedding, in front of everyone she was trying to impress, I was going to end her game permanently. June 14th, 2023. I woke up at 5 in the morning after maybe 3 hours of broken sleep. I'd been having nightmares all week, dreams where I showed Daniel the evidence and he looked at me with hatred, where Jessica convinced everyone I'd fabricated everything, where I became the villain in a story that should have made me the hero. I got out of bed and went to my kitchen, made coffee I didn't drink, and sat staring at my purse where the USB drive sat in a small zippered pocket. That tiny piece of plastic contained 6 months of investigation, over $14,000 of my retirement savings, and the power to either save my son or destroy my relationship with him forever. I could still change my mind. I could call Carmen Rodriguez right now, tell her there'd been a mistake, ask her to delete the video file, and pretend this had never happened. I could drive to Ashford Estate, pull Daniel aside before the ceremony, and show him everything privately, the way a normal person would handle this situation. But I kept thinking about what Patricia had said. If I told Daniel privately, Jessica would have the opportunity to manipulate the situation. She'd cry and apologize and claim the evidence was taken out of context. She'd say Robert Chen had fabricated the surveillance or that I'd hired actors to pose as her affair partners. She was brilliant at deception, and she'd been successfully lying to Daniel for 2.5 years. There was a real chance he'd believe her explanations over the evidence, or at minimum, he'd be confused enough to give her another chance. And if that happened, if he married her anyway because he loved her and wanted to believe in her, I would have shown my hand for nothing. Jessica would know I was onto her. She'd be more careful going forward. And I'd have permanently damaged my relationship with Daniel by violating his trust and privacy. No, the only way this worked was if the reveal was so public and so undeniable that Jessica couldn't spin it. 200 witnesses seeing the same evidence at the same time meant she couldn't claim later that it was fake or manipulated. The truth needed to be unavoidable. I got dressed around 7, even though I didn't need to leave for the venue until noon. I'd bought a new dress for the occasion, navy blue, simple and elegant, the most expensive item of clothing I'd purchased in years. It cost $140 from Macy's, which felt extravagant but appropriate for my son's wedding. I did my hair and makeup with steady hands, surprising myself with how calm I felt. I'd expected to be shaking with nerves, but instead, I felt this strange sense of clarity and purpose. I was doing the right thing. It was going to hurt Daniel terribly in the short term, but in the long term, I was saving him from a nightmare marriage to a woman who would have destroyed him financially and emotionally. I kept repeating that to myself like a mantra. This is the right thing. This will save him. He'll understand eventually. I arrived at Ashford Estate at 12:30. The venue was stunning, exactly the kind of place Jessica would choose. Historic mansion, manicured gardens, old money elegance everywhere you looked. Luxury cars filled the parking area, guests arriving in designer clothes and expensive jewelry, the kind of crowd that made me acutely aware of my department store dress and 10-year-old shoes. The ceremony was scheduled for 1 o'clock on the mansion's back lawn, overlooking ornamental gardens. White chairs arranged in perfect rows, thousands of white roses everywhere, a string quartet playing classical music, everything picture perfect and expensive. I found my assigned seat and my stomach dropped. 3rd row. Not the front row where the mother of the groom traditionally sits, but the 3rd row, behind Jessica's parents and her extended family. Jessica had told Daniel that the front row was for immediate family only, somehow excluding me from that category, despite the fact that I'd raised him alone for 17 years after his father died. It was a small cruelty, easily explained away as a space issue or a tradition from Jessica's family. but it was deliberate. Jessica had been systematically pushing me to the margins of Daniel's life for 2 years, and this seating arrangement was just another example. I sat down in my third-row seat and waited, watching guests arrive, watching Daniel greet people near the front, watching Jessica's bridesmaids fuss over last-minute details. The ceremony started promptly at 1. The string quartet transitioned to Pachelbel's canon, and everyone stood as the bridal party began their processional. Then came Jessica, walking down the aisle on her father's arm, wearing a Vera Wang gown that I knew cost $12,000 because I'd overheard her telling one of her bridesmaids about it. She looked absolutely stunning, like something from a bridal magazine. Perfect hair and makeup and dress and flowers, the image of a beautiful bride on the happiest day of her life. And Daniel's face when he saw her walking toward him broke my heart. He looked at her with such complete love and adoration, like she was the answer to every prayer he'd ever prayed, like he was the luckiest man in the world. For a moment I questioned everything I was about to do. My son was happy, genuinely, radiantly happy, and I was about to destroy that happiness in the most public and humiliating way possible. Was I doing the right thing? Or was I about to make the biggest mistake of my life? Then I thought about the evidence on that USB drive. Jessica with Richard Westbrook at hotels 43 different times. Jessica spending every Wednesday afternoon with Kyle Torres, lying to Daniel about yoga classes. Jessica at Dr. Sutton's cabin every other weekend, lying about spa retreats with girlfriends. The seeking arrangement profile, where she advertised herself to wealthy men for $500 per date. The credit card fraud, the abortion she'd had without ever telling Daniel she was pregnant with another man's child. This woman, standing at the altar, in a white dress symbolizing purity and commitment, was neither pure nor committed. She was a con artist who'd targeted my son because he was stable and respectable and could give her the legitimate cover she needed while she continued her actual life. Daniel's happiness was built on lies, and lies, no matter how beautiful they look in the moment, always collapse eventually. Better for them to collapse now, before legal marriage, before children, before years of his life were wasted, than later when the damage would be so much worse. The ceremony proceeded. Traditional vows that Jessica recited with perfect emotion, looking into Daniel's eyes and promising to love and cherish him, forsaking all others until death do them part. I wondered if she felt anything at all saying those words, knowing they were lies, or if she'd become so practiced at deception that the words meant nothing to her. Daniel's vows were genuine, heartfelt, emotional. He cried while saying them. Several guests cried watching him. I didn't cry. I sat in my third-row seat with my hands folded in my lap and waited. The officiant pronounced them husband and wife. They kissed, the quartet played, everyone applauded and cheered. And I reminded myself that they hadn't signed the marriage license yet. In Pennsylvania, the license gets signed after the ceremony, usually during cocktail hour, with just the officiant and 2 witnesses present. Until that license was signed, they weren't legally married. I still had time. Cocktail hour was held inside the mansion in an elegant room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the gardens. Servers circulated with champagne and hors d'oeuvres. A jazz trio played, guests mingled, and congratulated the happy couple. Daniel was surrounded by friends and colleagues, shaking hands, accepting hugs, looking happier than I'd seen him in years. Jessica held court with her sorority sisters near the windows, laughing and showing off her rings, basking in the attention. I stood alone near the hallway leading to the restrooms, sipping water, watching everything, waiting for my moment. Around 2:30, I saw Jessica excuse herself from her friends and start walking toward the hallway where I was standing. She saw me, and her expression shifted subtly, a flash of something cold in her eyes before the smile locked back into place. She walked directly toward me, and I knew whatever was about to happen wasn't going to be pleasant. "Margaret," she said loudly enough that several nearby guests turned to look. "I need to speak with you for a moment." She took my arm, her grip tight enough to be uncomfortable, and pulled me down the hallway away from the main crowd. Several guests followed at a distance, phones in hand, clearly sensing drama. Jessica stopped in a quiet corner and turned to face me, her smile still perfect, but her eyes hard. "I wanted to thank you for coming today," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I know this must be difficult for you, being somewhere so elegant, being around people so far above your usual social circle." I felt the words like a physical slap, but I kept my expression neutral. "Excuse me," I said quietly. Jessica leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that was still loud enough for the nearby eavesdroppers to hear. "Let's not play games, Margaret. You and I both know you don't belong here. Daniel and I actually argued about whether to invite you at all. My useless, working-class mother-in-law who raised him in poverty and clings to him like he's still a child. But in the end, we decided it would be too cruel not to invite you. After all, you are his mother, even if you embarrass him every time you open your mouth. She paused, watching my face for a reaction, clearly expecting me to cry or get angry or leave. Then she delivered her final line with perfect theatrical timing. But let's be honest, Margaret, you're only here out of pity. The hallway went completely silent. The guests who'd been pretending not to listen were now openly staring. This was the moment Jessica had been building toward for 2 years, the final assertion of her dominance, the ultimate humiliation designed to put me in my place and make sure I understood that in her marriage to Daniel, I would have no power and no voice. She wanted me to break down, to prove to everyone watching that I was weak and pathetic and deserving of her contempt. Instead, I smiled. A calm, genuine smile. "Thank you for being so honest with me, Jessica," I said clearly. "I really appreciate the transparency. It's good to know exactly where we stand." Jessica's smile faltered. She'd expected tears or anger or submission, and my calm acceptance clearly confused her. She opened her mouth to say something else, but I was already turning away, walking back toward the main area with steady steps and my head high. I went directly to the ballroom where the reception dinner would be held. Carmen Rodriguez was near the AV booth, talking to the technical team about the evening's schedule. I walked up to her and said quietly, "Carmen, it's time. Play the video." She looked at me confused. "But Mrs. Sullivan, we're not at that part of the program yet. The toasts aren't for another hour." I met her eyes and said firmly, "Now please." Something in my voice, or maybe something in my expression, made Carmen nod. She turned to the AV technician and said, "Cue the special tribute video, the one on the USB drive I gave you yesterday." The technician nodded and began typing on his laptop. Guests started filing into the ballroom from cocktail hour, taking their assigned seats, the energy festive and celebratory. Daniel and Jessica entered to enthusiastic applause and made their way to the head table at the front of the room. The room settled. Daniel stood to give his thank you speech, which wasn't technically scheduled yet, but no one was going to stop the groom from speaking. He talked about how grateful he was to everyone for coming, how much it meant to celebrate with family and friends, how he'd found his soulmate in Jessica and couldn't imagine life without her. He talked about building a future together, about the family they'd create, about growing old together. Jessica sat beside him glowing, occasionally reaching up to dab tears from her eyes, the picture of a devoted bride. Daniel finished his speech to warm applause and sat down, taking Jessica's hand and kissing it. And then I stood up. My chair scraped against the floor, the sound loud in the settling room. Conversation stopped. Heads turned. It was unusual for the mother of the groom to speak during the reception, and the surprise on people's faces was evident. I could see Daniel looking at me confused but smiling, probably thinking I was about to give some embarrassing motherly toast. Jessica's expression had gone very still, her smile frozen in place but her eyes sharp and alert. "Excuse me, everyone," I said, my voice steady and clear. "I have a small tribute I'd like to share with the bride and groom, something I think everyone here needs to see." I looked directly at Carmen and gave her a small nod. She hesitated for just a second, then signaled the AV technician. The lights in the ballroom dimmed. The 3 massive screens positioned around the room, meant for displaying photos and videos during the reception, flickered to life. And there, in high definition on screens visible to all 200 guests, appeared the title screen of Robert Chen's investigative report. The words appeared in simple white text on a black background. "The truth about Jessica Mitchell, a 6-month investigation." The room went absolutely silent. I sat down and watched the screens, and I waited for my son's world to end. The title screen faded, and the first image appeared on all 3 screens simultaneously. Daniel and Jessica at a restaurant, smiling at the camera, clearly from early in their relationship. The photo was sweet and innocent, exactly the kind of image you'd expect in a wedding tribute video. Guests relaxed slightly. Some even smiled, thinking this was going to be a sentimental slideshow of the couple's relationship. The image stayed on screen for maybe 5 seconds. Then it dissolved to the second image. Jessica in a dimly lit bar, sitting close to a silver-haired man I recognized immediately as Richard Westbrook. They were kissing. Not a friendly peck on the cheek, but a passionate kiss. Her hand on his face, his hand on her waist. In the bottom right corner of the image was a timestamp, November 12, 2022, 7:43 p.m. Location data showing the exact address of an upscale bar in Rittenhouse Square. The room erupted in gasps and confused murmurs. Jessica was on her feet instantly, her face draining of color. "Turn it off!" she screamed toward the AV booth. "Turn that off right now!" But the images kept coming, one after another, in methodical succession. Jessica and Richard Westbrook entering Le Bernardin restaurant. Timestamp February 8th, 2023, at 7:05 p.m. Daniel's birthday, the night she'd claimed to be flying to Miami for her grandmother's emergency. Jessica and Richard walking together toward the Meridian Hotel. Timestamp February 8th, 9:42 p.m. Jessica exiting the Meridian alone, her hair disheveled, carrying her shoes. Timestamp February 9th, 12:17 a.m. Each photograph was crystal clear, professionally taken, with timestamp and location data that made it impossible to claim they were old or taken out of context. The murmuring in the ballroom grew louder, guests standing up, some pulling out phones to record what was happening, others just staring at the screens in shock. Then came the photos of Kyle Torres. Jessica entering an apartment building in yoga clothes. Timestamp showing Wednesday, March 15th at 2:12 p.m. Jessica exiting the same building 3.5 hours later, wearing completely different clothes, jeans, and a t-shirt, her hair wet. Every Wednesday for 6 weeks, the same pattern. Arrival at 2 p.m., departure around 5:30 p.m., always with changed clothes and wet hair. Robert's investigation had been thorough enough to include a photo of the building's tenant directory showing Kyle Torres in apartment 314. Then came images of Dr. Andrew Sutton. Jessica meeting a man at a Wawa parking lot, transferring her overnight bag from her car to his Range Rover. The two of them, at a cabin in the Poconos, hiking together, cooking dinner on a deck, kissing beside a lake. Multiple weekends documented with precise timestamps. Every time Jessica had told Daniel she was at a spa retreat with her college girlfriends, she'd actually been at this cabin with another man. "This is fake," Jessica was screaming, trying to push through guests toward the AV booth. She hired someone to Photoshop these. "She's been stalking me. She's obsessed with destroying our relationship." But her protests sounded increasingly desperate as more evidence appeared on screen. Screenshots from the Seeking Arrangement website showing Jessica's profile, her username, honeyv_Philly, her photos in expensive dresses and designer accessories, her bio describing herself as sophisticated and selective, looking for mutually beneficial arrangements. Her stated rates: $500 for dinner dates, $2,000 for overnight companionship, $5,000 for weekend trips. Message exchanges between Jessica and various men, negotiating terms, confirming meetings, discussing payment. All of it timestamped, all of it archived, all of it completely damning. Several guests had their phones out now, some filming the screens, others filming Jessica's meltdown, the whole scene being documented from multiple angles. Then the videos started playing. Not still photographs, but actual video footage. 10-second clips edited together in rapid succession. Jessica entering hotel lobbies with different men. Jessica in restaurant booths, holding hands across tables, accepting gifts. Jessica getting into expensive cars. Jessica leaving apartments early in the morning. Each clip was brief, but the cumulative effect was devastating. This wasn't one mistake or one affair. This was systematic, ongoing, constant deception. The final video was longer, maybe 30 seconds. Hotel room footage that Robert must have obtained through methods I didn't want to think too closely about. Jessica and Richard Westbrook together in a way that left absolutely no room for innocent explanation. The timestamp showed May 28th, 2023, 16 days before this wedding. While Daniel had been finalizing seating charts and confirming the honeymoon reservations, his fiancée had been in a hotel room with her wealthy married boyfriend. I watched Daniel's face as he stared at the screens. He'd gone completely still, standing at the head table like a statue, his expression cycling through confusion and disbelief and slowly dawning horror. "What is this?" he said, his voice barely audible. "What am I looking at?" The video ended and the screens went black for a moment before cycling back to the beginning, ready to play the whole presentation again. Carmen had the decency to signal the technician to stop it there, to not make everyone watch it loop endlessly. The ballroom was in complete chaos now. Guests on their feet, some trying to leave, others clustering in groups to discuss what they'd just witnessed. Jessica's mother was sobbing loudly. Her father was trying to get to me, his face purple with rage, but Daniel's best man and several other guests were blocking his path. And Jessica, perfect poised Jessica, who always had the right words for every situation, stood in the middle of the ballroom in her $12,000 wedding gown, mascara streaming down her face, her carefully constructed life collapsing in real time. Daniel slowly reached up and removed his wedding ring, the simple gold band he'd been wearing for less than 90 minutes. He placed it on the table in front of him with a soft metallic clink that somehow carried through the noisy ballroom. "The wedding is over," he said, his voice hollow and broken. "Everyone needs to leave. Please just go home." Jessica seemed to snap out of her shock at his words. She rushed toward him, stumbling in her heels, her dress tangling around her legs. "James, please," she said, using his given name, which I'd noticed she rarely did, preferring to call him honey or babe. "This isn't what it looks like. Your mother is lying. She hired people to fake this evidence. She's been trying to ruin us from the beginning because she's jealous and possessive and can't stand that you love someone more than you love her." The accusation was calculated, designed to make Daniel question my motives rather than accept the evidence. But it fell flat against the weight of what everyone had just witnessed. "How many?" Daniel asked quietly. Jessica grabbed his hands, trying to make him look at her. "What?" she said. "How many men, Vanessa?" The question hung in the air. Jessica opened her mouth, closed it, her mind clearly racing to find some explanation that would make this okay. "This is insane," she tried again. "Those photos are edited, the videos are fake. Your mother has been stalking me for months, harassing me, and now she's created this elaborate lie to destroy our wedding day." Daniel pulled his hands away from her. "How many men have you been sleeping with while we were together?" he asked again, his voice getting louder. "How many men have you lied to me about? How many times did you cancel our plans or tell me you were somewhere else while you were actually in a hotel room or at some other man's apartment? Answer the question, Vanessa. How many?" Jessica's carefully maintained composure finally shattered completely. She started screaming, her voice shrill and defensive. "It didn't mean anything," she shouted. "It was just sex, just money. It wasn't real like we're real. You were the one I was going to marry. You were stable and respectable and safe. You were my future. They were just transactions. You were the one I actually loved." The confession, framed as a defense, was perhaps the most damaging thing she could have said. She'd just admitted to everything while simultaneously trying to minimize it, to claim it didn't count because her feelings for Daniel were supposedly genuine. But all Daniel heard was the confirmation that every photograph, every video, every piece of evidence was real. His fiancée had been living a double life for their entire relationship. She'd been selling herself to other men while planning a future with him. And she was now trying to claim this was somehow an expression of love. "Get out," Daniel said quietly. Jessica reached for him again, but he stepped back like she was contaminated. "Get away from me," he said louder. "Get out of here. I never want to see you again." Jessica's parents finally made it through the crowd and grabbed their daughter by the arms. Her mother was crying, repeating, "Oh my God, over and over." Her father looked like he might have a stroke, his face red and sweating. They started dragging Jessica toward the exit while she fought them, still trying to get back to Daniel, still trying to explain or justify or somehow make this right. As they reached the ballroom doors, Jessica turned back and her eyes found me standing near my table. She pointed at me with a shaking hand and screamed loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'll sue you for defamation. I'll destroy you. You have no idea what you've just done. You've ruined my life. You'll pay for this." Then her parents pulled her through the doors and she was gone, her voice echoing down the hallway as they dragged her away. The ballroom started emptying quickly after that. Guests filing out in shocked silence, some offering apologetic looks to Daniel as they passed, most just wanting to escape the awkwardness. Within 20 minutes, the room had mostly cleared, except for a few staff members starting to clean up, and a handful of Daniel's closest friends who stood at a distance, not sure if they should approach him or give him space. Daniel sat down heavily in his chair at the head table, staring at nothing, his expression blank and hollow. I approached slowly, my heart hammering, terrified of what he was going to say to me. When I got close enough, I said his name softly. "James." He didn't look at me. "How long have you known?" he asked, his voice flat and emotionless. I swallowed hard. 8 months. I've known for 8 months. The confession hung between us. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, processing that timeline. Then he looked up at me, and the expression on his face was worse than anger. It was betrayal. "You knew for 8 months, he repeated slowly, like he was trying to make sense of it. "You watched me plan this wedding for 8 months. You helped me address invitations. You came to venue tastings. You contributed money to help pay for all of this. And the entire time you knew she was cheating on me. The entire time you knew I was being lied to and used, and you said nothing. I tried to explain. If I had told you privately, she would have convinced you I was lying. She would have manipulated the situation. I needed you to see the evidence in a way that couldn't be denied. Daniel stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. So you decided to humiliate me instead, he said, his voice rising. You decided to show my private life, my relationship, the worst moment of my entire existence, to 200 people. My friends, my colleagues, my family, everyone I know just watched videos of my fiancé sleeping with other men. Do you have any idea what you've done to me? How am I supposed to face any of those people again? How am I supposed to go back to work where everyone saw that? How am I supposed to move on from this when it's been documented and recorded and is probably already going viral online? The accusation hit hard, because he was right. In saving him from Jessica, I'd also exposed him to public humiliation on a scale that would follow him for years. If I'd told you privately, I started to say, but Daniel cut me off. I'm a grown man, he shouted. I'm 32 years old. I'm not a child who needs his mother to make decisions for him. You should have told me the truth and let me handle it. You should have trusted me to do the right thing. Instead, you treated me like I was too stupid or too weak to face reality. You made this choice for me, and now I'm the one who has to live with the consequences. He was breathing hard, tears streaming down his face, his whole body shaking. I need you to leave, he said quietly. I need to be alone. I need to process this without you here. Please just go. I tried to reach for him, but he stepped back. Go, Mom, please, just go. So I left. I walked out of that ballroom, past the confused staff and the lingering guests, through the beautiful mansion and the manicured gardens, to my car in the parking lot. And I sat there alone, wondering if I just saved my son or lost him forever. Daniel didn't speak to me for 3 weeks after the wedding. 3 weeks of complete silence. I called him every day, and the calls went straight to voicemail. I texted him every morning and every night, simple messages telling him I loved him and I was there when he was ready to talk. No response. I drove to his apartment 5 times and knocked on the door, knowing he was inside because his car was in the parking lot, but he never answered. I left food on his doorstep, groceries I knew he liked, and they'd be gone the next day, so I knew he was at least eating. But there was no communication, no acknowledgement, nothing. Those 3 weeks were the longest of my entire life. Longer than the weeks after Thomas died. Longer than any shift I'd ever worked at the hospital. Longer than the months of watching Daniel plan a wedding I knew would never happen. Because at least during those months I'd known what I was doing and why. But now, sitting in the aftermath, I had no idea if I'd made the right choice or destroyed the most important relationship in my life. I talked to Patricia almost every night during those 3 weeks. She tried to reassure me that Daniel just needed time to process everything. That the shock and humiliation were too fresh for him to think clearly about what I'd actually done for him. But even Patricia admitted she didn't know how this would end. She'd seen cases in her law practice where family members never reconciled after betrayals far less significant than public humiliation at a wedding. I barely slept during those weeks. I'd lie awake replaying the whole thing in my mind, wondering if there had been another way. Could I have shown him the evidence privately the morning of the wedding? Could I have staged some kind of intervention with his closest friends? Could I have found a way to expose Jessica that didn't involve 200 witnesses and video that was now circulating on social media? Because Daniel had been right about that. The wedding disaster had gone viral. Someone had posted cell phone footage to Twitter, and within 48 hours, it had millions of views. Reddit threads dissected every detail. TikTok users did reaction videos. My son's worst moment had become entertainment for strangers on the internet. On the 22nd day after the wedding, a Wednesday evening, my phone rang. Daniel's name appeared on the screen, and I almost dropped the phone in my rush to answer it. His voice was flat and emotionless. "Lou's Diner," he said. "Tomorrow at 7 p.m. Then he hung up before I could respond. I spent the next 24 hours terrified and hopeful in equal measure. Lou's Diner was a place we'd gone together throughout his childhood, a neighborhood restaurant with vinyl booths and decent coffee where we'd celebrated small victories and talked through problems. The fact that he'd chosen that location felt significant, like maybe he was open to reconciliation, or maybe he just wanted neutral territory for whatever he was about to say. I arrived 15 minutes early and sat in a booth near the back, the same booth we'd always requested when he was younger. At 7 o'clock exactly, Daniel walked in. He looked terrible. He'd lost at least 15 pounds, had dark circles under his eyes, and was wearing rumpled clothes like he'd stopped caring about his appearance. He slid into the booth across from me, without greeting, without eye contact, and ordered black coffee when the waitress came over. We sat in silence for several minutes, both of us staring at our coffee cups, neither knowing how to start this conversation. Finally, Daniel spoke. "How long have you known?" he asked. I'd already told him this at the wedding, but I understood he needed to hear it again, needed to process the timeline. 8 months, I said. "Since February, since your birthday when I saw her at Le Bernardin with Richard Westbrook." Daniel nodded slowly like he was doing calculations in his head. "So, through the engagement party in March," he said. "Through Easter dinner with my friends in April. Through my birthday party in May where she gave that speech about how much she loved me. Through every single wedding planning, meeting and vendor appointment, and all of it. You knew the entire time and said nothing." "Yes," I admitted. "I said nothing because I was gathering evidence, and because I knew if I told you privately, she would manipulate the situation." Daniel's hands were shaking around his coffee cup. "Do you have any idea what the last 3 weeks have been like for me?" he asked. "I had to take a leave of absence from work because I couldn't face my colleagues after they saw that video. I had to delete all my social media accounts because strangers were tagging me in posts, making jokes about my failed wedding. I had to tell my friends over and over again what happened, reliving the humiliation each time. I've been in therapy 3 times a week, trying to process the fact that my entire relationship was a lie, and that my mother knew about it and chose to expose it in the most public way possible." His voice cracked on the last words. I felt tears streaming down my face. "I know," I said. "I know I hurt you. I know I humiliated you, and I'm sorrier for that than I can ever express. But Daniel, if I had told you privately, you wouldn't have believed me. Or you would have confronted her, and she would have cried and apologized and convinced you to give her another chance. And you would have married her anyway." "Would I have?" Daniel challenged. "You don't know that. You don't know what I would have done because you didn't give me the chance to make my own decision. You took away my agency. You treated me like a child who couldn't handle adult information." He was right, and I acknowledged it. "You're right," I said. "I made a choice for you instead of trusting you to make it yourself. And I'm sorry for that. But Daniel, I do know you. I've known you your whole life, and I know that you loved Jessica so much that you would have wanted to believe her explanations. You would have gone to couples counseling with her. You would have convinced yourself that she could change, that your love could fix her. And by the time you realized the truth, you would have been legally married, possibly with children, trapped in a nightmare you couldn't easily escape." I watched him process this, saw something shift in his expression. "You really think I would have stayed with her even after knowing what she'd done?" he asked quietly. "I think you loved her enough to try," I said. "And that's not a weakness, Daniel. That's who you are. You're loyal and forgiving, and you see the best in people. Those are beautiful qualities. But Jessica would have exploited those qualities for years." We sat in silence again, the diner's ambient noise filling the space between us. The coffee pot brewing behind the counter, other diners' conversations, silverware clinking against plates. Finally, Daniel spoke again, his voice softer. "I talked to Richard Westbrook," he said. "Jessica's," he paused, searching for the right word. "One of her clients, I guess. I ran into him at a coffee shop downtown last week. He recognized me from the wedding video that went viral. Do you know what he told me?" I shook my head. "He said that everyone in Jessica's arrangement circle knew about me. That I was her cover boyfriend, the respectable engineer who made her look legitimate while she continued seeing paying clients. He said he'd assumed I knew and was okay with it, that we had some kind of open arrangement. He actually seemed surprised when I told him I'd had no idea. He said Jessica had talked about me sometimes, called me her retirement plan, the guy she'd eventually marry when she was ready to settle down and needed someone stable to support her." Richard seemed genuinely sympathetic. He told me I was lucky to find out before we were legally married. He said he knows men who've been in similar situations and didn't discover the truth until years into their marriages. I watched Daniel's face as he recounted this conversation, saw the pain and humiliation and slow acceptance moving across his features. After talking to Richard, Daniel continued, "I started really looking at all the evidence your investigator gathered. Not just watching it in shock at the wedding, but actually examining it. The timestamps, the locations, the pattern of deception. She was so methodical about it, Mom. She had a whole separate life that she maintained perfectly while pretending to love me and plan a future with me. The credit card fraud, the abortion she never told me about, the years of lying, and I realized something." He looked directly at me for the first time since sitting down. "If you had told me about this privately, even with all that evidence, I probably would have confronted her first. I would have given her a chance to explain. And Jessica is so good at manipulation that she might have convinced me that the evidence was misleading or that she'd made mistakes, but truly loved me and would change. You were right that I would have wanted to believe her because I loved her so much. So what you did at the wedding, Daniel continued slowly. As horrible and humiliating as it was, it didn't give her any room to manipulate the narrative. 200 people saw the same evidence at the same time. She couldn't claim it was fake when everyone watched those videos. She couldn't convince me I was overreacting when my friends and family all witnessed her confession. It was brutal, but it was effective. I felt hope bloom in my chest for the first time in 3 weeks. Does that mean you understand why I did it? I asked. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. I understand why, he said finally. That doesn't mean I'm okay with how. I'm still angry at you for not trusting me enough to tell me privately. I'm still humiliated that my personal life became viral entertainment. I'm still hurt that you carried this secret for 8 months while I was happily planning a future that you knew was built on lies. Those feelings are real, and they don't just go away because I understand your reasoning. But, he paused and took a shaky breath. I'm also grateful, because you were right. I would be married to her right now. And eventually, I would have discovered the truth in an even worse way, maybe after we had kids, maybe after years of my life were wasted. We talked for 4 more hours that night. I told him everything about the investigation, showed him Robert Chen's full report on my phone, answered every question he had about the timeline and the decision-making process. Daniel told me about the therapy he'd started, about processing not just Jessica's betrayal, but also his feelings about what I'd done. His therapist had helped him understand that both things could be true simultaneously. Jessica had betrayed him horrifically, and I had violated his trust by keeping secrets and making decisions for him. He could be grateful to be free of Jessica, while also being angry at me for the method of exposure. These weren't contradictory feelings, they were the complex reality of an impossible situation. When we finally left the diner after 11 that night, Daniel hugged me for the first time since the wedding. It wasn't a long hug, and it wasn't without tension, but it was something. I don't know if I can forgive you completely, he said quietly. Not yet, but I want to try. Can we start having our Sunday dinners again? I nodded, crying too hard to speak. We started slowly. Sunday dinners every week. Casual conversations rebuilding trust. That was 6 months ago. Today, it's December of 2023, and Daniel and I have dinner together every Sunday, just like we did before Jessica entered his life. The relationship isn't exactly what it was. There's a new awareness between us. An acknowledgement that I'm capable of keeping significant secrets and making unilateral decisions that affect his life. But there's also a deeper honesty now. Daniel has started telling me when he disagrees with my opinions instead of just accommodating me. I've started asking his permission before making decisions that involve him instead of assuming I know what's best. We're rebuilding on a foundation that's different but maybe stronger than before. He's still in therapy working through everything. The betrayal, the public humiliation, the viral videos that still circulate occasionally when someone rediscovers the story and posts it again. But he's healing. He started dating again recently, taking it very slowly, being much more cautious about who he trusts. And last week, something happened that made all of it, all the money spent and the risk taken and the pain endured, feel worth it. Daniel and I were having our Sunday dinner at my house, and he told me about running into Richard Westbrook again. They'd had a longer conversation this time. Richard had apologized for his role in deceiving Daniel, said he hadn't known the full extent of Jessica's lies, and felt guilty for being part of it. Then Richard told Daniel something that changed his perspective on everything. He said that in the arrangement community, Jessica had a reputation for targeting genuinely good men, not just for money, but for the legitimacy and social cover they provided. Richard knew of at least 3 other men in the past 5 years who Jessica had dated seriously while maintaining her paid arrangements, men who had no idea about her double life. One of them had married her. They'd been married for 18 months before he discovered the truth. The divorce had been devastating, complicated by shared property and the fact that she'd gotten pregnant with another man's child during the marriage. That man's life had been destroyed in ways that took years to recover from. If you hadn't done what you did, Daniel said to me, his eyes wet with tears, I would be that guy right now. I'd be legally married to her. She'd probably be pregnant with someone else's baby. I'd have joint bank accounts she was draining. I'd be stuck in a nightmare marriage trying to figure out how to extricate myself. Instead, because of what you did, I walked away completely free. No legal entanglement, no shared assets, just a humiliating memory that fades more every day. He reached across my kitchen table and took my hand. So thank you, Mom, he said. Thank you for being willing to be the villain in my story for a while. Thank you for spending your retirement savings to save me from something I was too blind to see. Thank you for making the hard choice even knowing I might hate you for it. I don't hate you. I'm actually grateful. Even if it took me 6 months to get here. We both cried then. The kind of tears that release pressure that's been building for too long. The kind that wash away resentment and fear and start to heal what's been broken. I would do it all again, I told him. Even knowing how angry you'd be, even knowing the cost, I would make the same choice every single time. Because you're my son, and protecting you is more important to me than anything else in this world. Daniel smiled, a real, genuine smile, the first I'd seen from him since before the wedding. I know, Mom, he said. I finally understand that now. So here we are, 6 months after the wedding that never was. Some people who've heard this story think I went too far, that public humiliation is never justified, that I should have trusted my adult son to handle the information privately and make his own choices. Maybe they're right. Maybe there was a better way that I couldn't see at the time. But I know my son better than anyone else in this world. I know he would have confronted Jessica privately, and I know she would have cried and manipulated and possibly convinced him to give her another chance. And I know that second chance would have led to marriage and years of deception and eventual discovery in circumstances far more damaging than what actually happened. I spent my entire retirement savings, almost $18,000, to hire a private investigator and document the truth. I risked the most important relationship in my life. I became the subject of viral videos and online discussions, portrayed sometimes as a hero and sometimes as a controlling monster. I made choices that caused my son genuine pain and humiliation. But I also saved him from a predator who would have destroyed his life. Was it worth it? Every single penny. Every sleepless night. Every moment of doubt and fear. Every second of those 3 weeks when I thought I'd lost him forever. All of it was worth it to see him free and healing and starting to build a life based on truth instead of lies. Because sometimes love isn't about making people happy in the moment. Sometimes love is about protecting them from dangers they can't see. Sometimes the greatest act of love is being willing to be misunderstood, to be hated temporarily, to be the villain in someone's story, if that's what it takes to save them. I'm Margaret Sullivan. I'm 58 years old. I'm a retired nurse from Philadelphia with no savings left and no regrets. If I could go back to that moment in my kitchen on the morning of June 14th, holding that USB drive and wondering if I was doing the right thing, I would make the same choice. I would give Carmen that drive. I would sit in that third-row seat and wait for my moment. I would stand up in that ballroom and show 200 people the truth. Because my son's freedom was worth more than his temporary happiness. His future was worth more than my retirement. And his life was worth every risk I took to protect it. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever had to make an impossible choice to protect someone you love, I want to hear about it. Drop a comment below and tell me your story. Tell me where you're watching from and whether you think I made the right choice or went too far. Have an honest conversation because these situations aren't black and white. They're complicated and painful, and there are no perfect answers. If you found value in hearing my story, do me a favor. Like this video, subscribe to this channel, and hit that notification bell so you never miss the stories we share here. These are real stories about real people facing impossible decisions. And if you know someone who's watching a loved one make a terrible mistake, someone who's struggling with whether to intervene or stay silent, share this video with them. Sometimes we need to hear other people's stories to find courage for our own situations. Thank you for listening to mine. Thank you for staying with me through this whole journey. This is Margaret, signing off.